What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of The Strength Classroom. Today, I have a very special guest, one of the OGs in online fitness. I think I saw him the first time. It must have been over 10, 15 years ago. Steve Shaw from the Massive Iron channel. I follow him on Instagram. I watch his YouTube videos, as should you. He has to be one of the greatest minds when it comes to strength and hypertrophy, and his methods are always very simple, which is the complete opposite that you see now on the internet. Everything's become so convoluted, and sometimes it's very refreshing to hear from someone that just has straightforward answers. So how are you doing today, Steve?
Good, man. That's the best introduction I've ever had. Thank you. Thank you. But I appreciate it. I've definitely been around forever and seen everything.
All right, so what I have my guests do in the beginning is if you can just, this might be easier said than done, but just maybe in 2 to 3 sentences, what your training philosophy is.
Okay, 2 to 3 sentences. I focus on building strength and muscle by attacking everything from head to toe and getting it as strong as possible. And I do so with an eye on not specific methods, but what I call the massive iron pillars of success, the commonalities that everybody has used in their training in the last 70 years.
Okay. So you have something called a rep goal system. Could you elaborate on that?
It's basically I have a math and science background. I like structuring things mathematically. I think that's one of the reasons why I like programming. You can find a lot of simple math how to structure programming. But anyway, the rep goal system basically is the only progression approach I used when I was coming up. I didn't say to myself I needed a progression approach. I just needed like a trigger when to add weight. I don't even think I knew what progression meant. I was just trying to beat the logbook. But basically, regardless of the number of sets you're doing, 2, 3, or 4, you're using the same weight for each set. In this structure, and you add up the reps from each set. Let's say 11, 9, and 7, you get 27. If you reach your trigger or the rep goal total, then you would move up in weight. So let's say you want to hit 30 total reps for 3 sets on maybe dumbbell curls. When you hit 30 on 3 sets, you just move up in weight. So it just was forcing me to stay focused and move up when I was supposed to move up.
Okay, and there's no like saving reps in the tank. Like set one, you're doing pretty much as many as you can with good form.
I don't like to use the word failure, and I don't like to speak in terms of reps in reserve. I have nothing against those concepts, but the thing I have always taught is maximum safe quality reps. I want to push a set as deep as I can, but have it sustainable. So I'll push a set for as many quality reps as possible, stopping the set when I feel like my form is going to break down or when I'm going to fail on the next rep. And I will say, just as an end cap, I try to do this 80% of the time, right? On the internet, everybody's like, you have to do every set all the time to maximum intensity. It's a long game. So I try to be solid on my sets 80% of the time, 100% of my workouts, if that makes sense.
Yeah, what you said about every set being like super intense, that's just not sustainable. It might look good on the internet and when you see everyone's highlights, but that's not sustainable, especially not for the average person. So the 80% number, that does make sense. How would you describe progressive overload? Just for I feel like that gets kind of lost on people now, even though it's a pretty simple concept in my opinion. But how could you best describe it for people that are still confused on just what something as basic as progressive overload is?
So I there's a couple ways I like to describe it. The first is like as an external force that's placing pressure upon us. However, this is kind of I don't know, a vaporous way of looking at it, but let's say you have a force placing pressure on you externally. Whatever force that is, your body will adapt to that external stress. Whether it's running, whether it's lifting, your body's going to adapt to that external force. If you never press harder or put more pressure on the body, it's going to settle in. It has no reason to. Over time, we have to continue to place more and more stress or external force on the body to get it to continue to react. And uh, the only way to do this in lifting is to add more weight over time. And this is where things get overly complicated in the lifting world when they really don't need to be. You just need a reasonable way of executing more and more force or pressure on the body. Basically, if you woke up one day and you had a backpack and that had a capability of carrying infinite number of bricks, and you put a brick in there and every day you added a brick, this would be progressive overload, or the slow increase of pressure or external force over a long period of time.
Okay, that's a good explanation. Now, do you feel like weight has to be added every week? And if it can't, what are some ways to I feel like I tell some clients this almost like trick them into that they've progressed from last week. Because most people, if they can't add weight, they think that's the only form of progressive overload.
Yeah, and that really works well when you're a novice, and you can add reps every week and add weight. But that, if you're doing things right, you're going to meet the end of that really quickly, and that's a positive thing. The one thing, let's use a lift like the bench press, for example. If you look at a 1 rep max calculator, when you add a rep to your top set, you're adding anywhere from 5 to 7 pounds to your 1 rep max. Over time, these are going to be dramatically reduced. You're not going to add a lot of reps over the course of a year unless you're very, very lucky. You can be adding strength without adding reps. Let's say your bench press is 185 by 5 and you want to get to 185 by 6. And in doing so, that would add 6 pounds to your projected 1 rep max. There's still a 6 pounds of steps that are involved in adding that rep. So a lot of times we just have to have faith, so to speak, in the process, trust that we're on the right tracks and that we are adding weight. We really have to stay out of our own heads. And we have to understand that the demands of every exercise is different. Every exercise is going to have its own progression track, and we can't place all exercises in the same basket and expect the same progression rate with every exercise, because every exercise is going to be different. You might hit the hard wall on lat pull downs after a year, but still be progressing on squats and deadlifts for a decade.
Yeah, that makes sense. When I was younger, I used to get frustrated just because pound for pound, let's say my bench only went up 20 pounds I say only 20 pounds in 2 months, and my deadlift went up 20 pounds as well. But I should have been more frustrated on my deadlift because that's an exercise that should hypothetically go up quicker just because you're moving a greater amount of weight. So you're right, every exercise does have its own little progression path, let's say, and they can't all be treated equal.
We do get hung up a little bit on watching all the freaks on social media just crush it, and we get these crazy expectations. In the world of coaching, getting somebody to a 225-pound bench and even a 315-pound squat with good form is a wonderful accomplishment.
Yeah, I even say everyone always talks about inflation of money, but I feel like there's been an inflation of gym lifts. Whereas a 405 squat used to be considered pretty respectful, but now if you compare it on the internet, it seems like everyone should be squatting 405 pounds, which if you look at it on a percentage of the entire population, that just clearly is not the case. That no one just walking around the street that doesn't train can just put 405 in their back and bury it. You're right. Getting to a 2 plate bench and a 3 plate squat, that's a pretty proud achievement that I'd say most people should have, and it shouldn't really be overlooked.
If I can just tell a quick story, if you don't mind. Back when I was at my biggest in I was basically in the bodybuilding world until 2007, and I stumbled across powerlifting, and that's when I started to give that a little bit of a run. At my heaviest, at 346 pounds, I was trying to reach a 2,000-pound raw total. And at the time, only 80 people in the history of the sport had that total. My last meet, I was probably pretty close to 1,900, give or take. But since that time, strength sports have absolutely exploded. And the number of people that have a 2,000-pound raw total is absolutely insane. Just, take that out to social media. You're seeing more and more ridiculous stuff every single day.
Yeah, I remember when I can't remember who had the first person to pass a 700-pound bench, and that was like untouched for years.
Unbelievable.
And now, then I think Scott Mendelson broke it, and then what was that guy's name at Super Training? Eric Spoto broke it, and that looked like that was the record. Like that's maybe someone beat it by like 5 pounds or so, and now Julius Maddox has just surpassed that, and it's like that was a record no one ever thought was imaginable of breaking. So like over time, you're right. I didn't know that at the time that only 80 people had total 2000. Pretty mind blowing to think of with how many people have done that I've just even paid attention to.
I think, not to go down a rabbit trail, but back then, 12, 15 years ago, a lot of people were proclaiming that powerlifting was dead because the single and multiply was becoming so popular. And what had actually happened at that time was more and more people were being introduced to strength training, and not just before that, everything was controlled by the bodybuilding magazines, and there were no strength training on the newsstands. And people were being introduced to strength training. There's such a large pool of lifters involved with it now that it has just exploded the sport and the records.
Yeah, it just I would say social media definitely played a huge role into that. But because just people are starting younger, so the younger you start, the more just window for progression you have when you're younger. But yeah, it's definitely exploded. What are some, I want to say common is the right word, common mistakes you see with not just beginners but literally anyone when they're trying to put on strength and muscle mass?
This is going to sound controversial to many people that haven't coached, and I don't mean that, as any form of an insult, but there's a big gap between those that coach for a living and those that see lifting on the internet. Before I got into coaching, I was, you better squat, you better deadlift, you better go hard, or you're an idiot, right? And the more I coach, the more I realize taking your squat and deadlift, you have to go slow. Your lower back's going to get beat up. These are very nuanced lifts. 70% of the population, it's going to take them a couple years to really master form unless they have a coach that is hands-on. So we have to go slower on the squat and deadlift, allow our lower back to get up to speed, not be so eager just to pile on weight. Make sure our form is good, because these are unforgiving lifts. Now, I'm not against the squat. I'm not against the deadlift. I think all these minimal programs where you take a novice and all they do is squat or deadlift, you're not doing dumbbell exercises. You're not building a muscle base. You're putting like 60% of your eggs in the squat or deadlift basket, where these guys simply aren't getting a lot out of it yet because their form is not up to speed. And therefore, they're not building a muscle base at a quality rate, which is, going to a muscle base is going to lend itself to future strength. So I think that's one of the biggest things I see as a coach is yes, we want to squat and deadlift, but yes, we maybe need to temper that a little bit and not be so aggressive while we have a little bit broader of a base.
Yeah, I do find that's a big problem. Like everyone just says squat, bench, deadlift, like that'll take care of most of your needs, row, pull up, whatever. But if they're not proficient in those exercises, they're not gonna get much from it. I'd agree with that. I even say to people when they're starting off, and this is very unconventional, just so they can get their balance, I actually start people off with a goblet squat But then once we go past 100 pounds, I actually then transition them over to a Zercher squat. One, it's just my favorite exercise. But two, I find just because the bar is lower, I find that the trainee's able to balance a bit better. It's something about once you put the hands behind someone's back that they get all kind of fucked up and then they can't hit depth. That's the biggest problem. And they're worried about being pitched forward. And I find that really doesn't happen with the Zercher squat. So I guess my follow up question would there is that one of the lifts that you would approve of?
Well, I would say you're on track because once you put a bar on somebody's back, there's a hesitation that they don't realize. And there's an awkwardness. Like if you tell somebody to do a front squat or a Zercher squat, they'll naturally get their legs in a natural position. Not to be redundant. You tell somebody to do a front squat, they're not going to put their legs out wide. They're not going to put their legs in narrow. They're just going to naturally settle in. Same with the Zercher squat. If you put a bar on their back, all of a sudden they're going to overthink. Wide leg and their knees are going to cave in and they're going to fold. And, the knees inside of the foot angle is the most common issue you see on a squat. But you are right. If you get them on a safety squat bar or a front squat or a Zercher, they're generally going to be more natural. And the advantage of a Zercher is a front squat can tend to be more forgiving because it's harder to keep the weight up. And if you're just holding it here and you're using a lighter weight, you're going to have the same mid back stress or lower back stress, but it's generally probably going to feel a little bit more natural. So I think you definitely have a valid point using that.
Yeah, that's why I always say just to put even if it's just the bar, just to put that on someone's back, it always felt so silly to me. Like if you want to do that near the end of the workout or as part of like let's say their cool down or whatever, just to work on getting into depth with the bar, almost like flexibility and mobility, then I think that's fine. But to spend, I don't know, 45 minutes with someone correcting all their squat mistakes when that could have gone to building muscle in other exercises that are easier, that have an easier, like let's say barrier to entry, it's a no-brainer to me.
And I just want to, make one additional point. My daughter ended up powerlifting, and she powerlifted from age 13 to 15. And for the first year, all we did was goblet squats. We didn't even think about a back squat until the goblet squat became second nature.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I feel like it's almost like a front squat for someone that can't do like the front rack position, essentially. All the mechanics are roughly the same, but I feel like some people just, I don't know, they feel like the goblet squat is not as, let's say, cool looking, but I don't know, once you get to an 100-pound dumbbell, it seems like it's a pretty legit lift, even just from the eye test.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to get to a point where just getting the dumbbell in the position is harder than the set. And at that point, you probably should be transitioning.
Yeah, that makes sense. You've talked a lot on your Instagram about people doing, let's say, a high volume approach as opposed to just maybe one or two dedicated sets. Can you just like elaborate on why that approach is favorable?
What I try to do when it comes to programming is I don't consider myself a high volume or low volume person. What I try to do and what other people view me as, that's fair. But what I try to do is uh, I try to look at how many days a week does somebody have to train? Three, 3.5, 4, 3.5. What does that mean? Every other day, right? So I try to, as a starting point, multiply the number of days a week they can train by 18 hard sets. This is a starting point and not a rule. So 18 hard sets is generally going to keep you in the gym roughly 75, maybe 80 minutes. But that's a starting point. And from there, you can adjust up, you can adjust down. Most people don't adjust up. I don't have clients really adjusting up. I have a couple freaks that just want to live in the gym, and that's good as long as they're recovering. You know, Generally, that's how I base it. That's how I determine weekly volume. From there, we'll distribute, what we do for chest, back, shoulders, quads, and other body parts, if that makes sense.
Okay. That that's interesting. I've never heard of the just the overall hard sets multiplied by how many. So would you give the same amount of sets to someone, let's say, that trains twice a week compared to 4 times a week?
No, so if you train twice a week, we're going to be very pragmatic. We're going to start with 36 hard sets or 18 per workout. I have people that want to do 2 hard sets per exercise. That's fine. I don't believe in magic systems. I do start them at that starting point. I find that most people are able to handle it, but I do not care if they don't like it. We'll just dial the volume down. Some people want to do 2 sets per exercise and they respond better, and that's fine, because I will always take the long-term view that we want it to be sustainable, enjoyable over the next 10 years rather than stick to a certain number of sets per exercise.
And the total set count, is that evenly distributed amongst muscle groups, or it all depends on what your clients want?
What I have is what's called the rule of 2/3. And I can't stress enough, these are all starting points. I don't have rules that we have to adhere to, but I do have starting points. And one of my core foundations is evolving training based on needs. Before I get into the rule of 2/3, what does that mean? You give someone a reasonable starting point, and they go into the gym and they don't like 8 rep sets on pendlay rows, so we do 6, or they don't like 3 sets of squats, so we do 2. As long as we have a reasonable change, we're okay. So we live in the land of reasonable. And does this have to make any sense to somebody that's an outsider? No, because as long as it's reasonable, and as long as somebody's not trying to drop to 4 sets per week for everything, we're in a good place. But I will start with the rule of 2/3. So let's say you have a lifter that can train 3 days a week. He's a father, he's 50, he wants to build muscle. 3 workouts a week times 18 hard sets is our starting point. That gives us 54 hard sets per week. And hard sets, that's just a generic way of phrasing it. But we use the rule of 2/3. 2/3 of those sets we are now going to apply to major areas of focus: chest, back, shoulders, and quads. So that gives us 36 sets a week that we're going to apply to these areas. And if you're training 3 days a week, basically 9 sets for chest, 9 for delts, 9 for quads, and 9 for back. As a starting point and not a rule. Then we have 1/3 of that volume left, which is 18. We're going to apply another rule of 2/3, and we're going to use that 18 sets. That would be 12 for biceps, triceps, and hamstrings. And anything else we have left, maybe you want to do forearms, maybe you want to do traps. I don't really work in abs or calves. That's a personal thing, but that's a starting point. And from there, we move around the pieces based on the preference and goals and equipment of the lifter.
Okay, that makes sense. You mentioned something, regardless, you said something that reminded me of just deadlifting in general. And why do you think that exercise has become so demonized lately?
I don't. It's just easy to demonize. It's easy to mess up. It's an unforgiving lift. The deadlift, more than anything, is a game of half inches. When you are coaching it, if your hips are down a little bit too far, or you're too seated, when you pull, your hips are going to want to fly up, your weight's going to want to move forward, you're going to transfer stress to your lower back. On the other side of the spectrum, if your hips are just a half-inch high and you pull, your hips are going to want to do this. The body is going to be very reactionary to not being in a perfect starting position. And the problem with that is you can't be in a perfect starting position every rep on a deadlift. So you have to be very disciplined. You have to, it's a very unforgiving lift. And I think it's misunderstood. A lot of people don't consider it good for hypertrophy. And this is just my opinion. I've talked to a lot of lifters that have had mediocre back gains until they started introducing things like the deadlift and more intense exercises. So I think it has an amazing potential to be a contributor to trap and back gains, but it also has a lot of downsides. And you have a lot of borderline influencers who don't have a lot of experience with this and coaching people with this, who don't see the value that it can add to hypertrophy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. But one major thing I feel like, let's say those influencers say the deadlift is bad. Okay. But then they won't even do something like a Romanian deadlift, just something that probably has less risk just because you're going to use less weight. And even still, it's like they can't possibly think I'm going to accept that all hinges are bad. It just seems like at the end of the day, the exercise is difficult, so they would rather do something that's easier, in my opinion. I think
So,
that's what it boils down to.
yeah, there's a lot of big targets in lifting. And over the years, you'll find, these a certain degree of influencers just targeting the big lifts. And you can't drop all the big lifts. I mean, you don't have to deadlift, but you do have to do something impactful for the back.
Yeah, I'd agree with that as well. It's funny you say that. Even yesterday, I did sumo deadlifts and I was trying some different form cues and I just did 5 sets of 5. I trained conjugate, so it was like my dynamic day. So they're like the lighter day. And I tried some cues where I was kind of using my torso a little bit more, let's say. And the rest was fairly short. And I was just walking around today at work and I was like, my lats are the sorest on me. That not that they've ever been, but for not doing dedicated like rowing back exercises. And I just feel like that thought is kind of lost on people, that if you're not isolating a muscle and squeezing and lengthening, that it's not growing. And I don't know where that attitude came from. I feel like when like these, like I call them like these aesthetic bros kind of became very popular on Instagram, that's when that mentality kind of seeped into everyone. I was talking to someone that I don't know if you're familiar with the channel. It's called The Stone Circle, and he only uses sandbags. And he said, if you just got someone who has zero knowledge of muscle growth and strength, and you showed them two exercises. You showed them someone doing bicep curls and someone lifting a very heavy weight, whether it's deadlifting or sandbag carries, whatever. And you would say which one is going to get you stronger or more muscular. They're obviously going to pick the one where the person is lifting more weight, just because it's intuitive. You're thinking that person's lifting a lot, so their muscles are going to get bigger. But for some reason, people want to isolate everything now. And isolations are good, don't get me wrong, but it just seems like it's so counterintuitive to what I consider to be common sense.
Yeah, I mean, the big picture, the when you step back a mile and look at the big picture, we inherently know that an impactful lift is an impactful lift. It is going to have a lot of value. But we try to deconstruct everything into body parts. And I think we can push this too far. There's value in this in hypertrophy, but we need to look at things more as a shotgun approach. Do I know specifically for every individual how impactful the dumbbell bench is going to be on the front delts, the triceps, the chest, or whatever? No, I don't know specifically because of their limb lengths and leverages and arm lengths. But I do know that if I put together 4 impactful lifts or 3 impactful lifts that are similar movement patterns, that it's going to take care of business. So we kind of use a shotgun approach, do as many big hitters as we can, and then we fill in this cascade with other less impactful lifts. Because as you move along in a workout, whether it's a full body workout or whether it's a upper lower, you're always going to have a rate of decay. You're not going to have as much energy at the end of a workout. People will kind of bash on a body part split because at the end you have less energy to focus on a body part. Well, it's really that way when you're training hard on any type of workout. So anyway, that's a rabbit trail, but I try to use a shotgun approach where, we're trying to use big hitters to, maximize coverage of the body and then fill in the gaps.
All right, that makes sense. And what percentage, I feel like this is a good segue, would you say that you give your clients or even your own personal workouts, compound versus isolation? Like, is there a lot? Is it mainly compound and then just maybe one or two isolations at the end?
I mean, legs are a little bit different, because you don't really have dumbbell exercises and machines can
Yeah, that
feel
makes sense.
different for each individual. But if they're The average individual that isn't trying to be a power lifter, we will, for chest, we'll do a barbell, a dumbbell, a machine, and then, something to fill in, whatever they want to do. I don't really particularly like cable crossovers. They have a very limited progression opportunity. I don't typically like to program them in, but like pec deck or a barrel press or a properly executed dumbbell fly, it's okay to have one exercise per body part that's a fun exercise, that you can be used as a finisher or something to do when you've expended 90% of your energy. Because I do like to look at things from a bigger picture. Does a dumbbell fly have a big progression opportunity? No. But if you put this in the big picture of the course of the week, training over the course of the week, it can add that little bit of 5%. Shoulders, the same thing, a barbell, a dumbbell, a machine, and, an additional exercise. Back, a little bit different. I like, dumbbell, barbell. I love seated cable rows, back. I think they're a very good exercise. Lat pull downs. Back gets complicated because not everybody can do pull-ups well, so we have to get kind of creative, and back has one of the few cable exercises in the seated cable row that I absolutely love. But, I try to work in my big hitters, a dumbbell, a barbell, and then fill in the gaps in a way that makes sense. S Squats, if I had my way, every gym would have a leverage squat because I think a leverage squat is one of the most underrated exercises for legs. And, if you're not familiar with the specific type of equipment I'm talking about, I have no affiliation with Titan Fitness, but I have their leverage squat here in the gym. You can basically get your butt down to your calves. You can get a really good quad stimulation. And I think it's a much better choice than a hack squat. But anyway, that's a discussion for another time.
Okay. I know. I'm just looking it up right here. My friend, he's in Vietnam for a few months, and the gym he's at has that, but he calls it a pendulum squat. So I was like, let me just see if it's the thing I'm thinking. And that it does look like a really good machine.
Yeah, it's a good supplement. The leg press, one of the things about the leg press is some of them can have a tendency to beat up your lower back. So, it depends on the machine and the individual, but it definitely can give you the snake bite effect when you're least
Yeah,
expecting.
the leg press is not a one size fits all. It's certain models are going to benefit certain body structures 100%. One thing I saw, I think it was one of the first videos I ever saw you do. It was like an over 200-pound dumbbell for dumbbell rows, and I think you were doing something called bulldozer sets on them. Would you be able to elaborate on that?
The rest pause protocol that I use, I call Bulldozer Work. And why do I call it Bulldozer Work? Because everything needs a name, right? I mean, to differentiate between another form of rest pause. And basically, back in the day, I have nothing but respect for Dante, who created DC Training. One of my favorite people to follow on Instagram. He doesn't post often, but he is no BS, right? So he had DC Training, and back around 2008, I decided to try it. I didn't like it as structured, so I modified it and created 4 or 5 sets. And basically, you rest 20 to 30 seconds between efforts, so on and so forth. But that's bulldozer training. That's rest pause training. It's just a style of rest pause, and you can vary the rest in between sets. But basically, if you're doing a heavy exercise, you're going to allow yourself a few seconds to catch your breath, and then you're going to get back at it before a muscle group can fully recover. You're kind of beating it while it's down, so to speak. The dumbbell row, I will say I picked up really bad elbow tendonitis around 1999. Straps weren't a thing for me. VersaGrip Pros weren't a thing for me. And all I was doing is like 120 pounds on dumbbell rows for 3 sets of 10. Led to a lot of elbow tendonitis. And when I got VersaGrips around 2008, I realized I could rip a lot of weight off the ground. And I like to. I got the most I've ever done is like a 270-pound dumbbell row for like 8 reps. I like doing dumbbell rows over 200 pounds. I've done them for 22, for 25 reps. It's just a personal obsession. That's the only way I can put it.
So you are, I'm assuming, after what you just said, in favor of the use of straps and belts, things like that.
I don't want to, pool straps and belts in the same thing, but in coaching, the two biggest injuries I see are lower back injuries and elbow tendonitis. And elbow tendonitis tends to come from over grip on deadlifts, on RDLs, on back work, not using grip support. So the way I put it is, if you're a serious lifter, you're going to end up with elbow tendonitis. And a majority of the contributor to this is going to be over grip, over reliance on grip on back work. So I'm a big proponent for the average lifter of using grip support. It allows you to use more weight on back exercises and generally deadlifts, and it'll save you a lot of pain in the long run.
The reason I throw belt in there is sometimes people act like not using a belt is somehow better or superior just because they don't quote unquote have to use a belt. I find that if you can lift more weight with a belt, especially if you have aspirations for powerlifting and you choose not to wear one, I think that's silly.
Well, I will say, like, if you look at my powerlifting meets, I'm not wearing a belt, right? So people will overanalyze that. And like back when I was a young lifter, I wore that cheap belt on everything, that cheap gym belt, man, with curls. I was wearing the belt. It was like your blankie, your banky, right? It was wearing, I had
Yeah.
it with everything. But when I started training again in my home gym, I didn't have a lot of money. So I fleshed out my home gym and I didn't think about a belt, so I just started training without a belt. And there's no rhyme or reason to it other than I didn't think about it. And I was an accidental power lifter. I do have a belt. At this stage in my lifting career, I don't need it. But what I would tell people is if you're a serious lifter, you probably need to get a belt and you need to play around with it. Do you need to use it? That's up to you, depending on your goals and whatnot. But a serious strength athlete definitely needs to get one and to play around with it.
Yep, I'd agree with that. But when it comes to periodization, what is your approach on, let's say, deloads or adjusting volume, adjusting intensity, just anything in that realm?
Well, I think we went through a period with deloads where we really overthought it for the average lifter. And I want to frame this on average lifter because, an average lifter is going to approach deloading and time away differently than somebody that has advanced strength levels. So we went through a phase with like Wendler's 531. I don't know what its current iteration is like, so I'm not making commentary, but you would have lifters taking every fourth week off. And I thought this was ridiculous, ridiculous waste of time.
That was actually the first video I ever saw of yours.
And I took a lot of heat over that, but I do not think novices and guys in their first 2 years of training need to take every fourth week as a deload, but they can do whatever they want. But when we look at the big picture of lifting in the real world, right, we're going to get sick during the year. We're going to have vacations. We're going to have birthdays. We're going to have time off where we can't lift due to the holidays and just time that we can't lift due to personal commitments. So we're going to have enough time trying to pull us away from the gym as it is. And then when we start arbitrarily planning deloads on top of that, we can really take a lot of gym time. It can take a lot of time away. So I think as a starting point, what I tell people is we need to learn intuitive deloading. I'm burnt out mentally. I'm going to take a couple days off. I'm burnt out physically or I feel a little bit beat up. I'm not just going to take a week off because I feel beat up mentally or physically. I'm going to take a couple days off. I'm going to see how I feel, and then we get back into the gym. So as a starting point, I want people to get intuitive. That's take a couple days off, see how our body feels. And I think that's a foundation that we have to learn. And then when you become more of an intermediate lifter, you're moving around a lot of weight. We have to listen to our body, and then we can start to worry about forms of periodization, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Now, typically people work within like a 7 day template. So like Monday is going to be this day, Wednesday is going to be this day. It Well, answer this question first. Is that typically how you would write a program?
No, never.
Okay.
I do things differently. I don't care. That works well if somebody wants to stick to the same day of the week and they like to train like that. But I find probably 80 to 90% of people need a flexible schedule. So it's not like we're doing anything easier. If I do my type of structure called an upper posterior, upper is chest, shoulders, and arms, posterior is legs and back. Um, we will, I'll give them a flexible schedule saying you can insert rest days as needed, but we probably need a minimum number of workout days per week. So we tend to do more flexible schedules unless somebody's
Okay. So
crazy needs
let's
to.
say, sorry, say that again.
I was just saying, unless somebody needs to do bench press on Monday.
Okay.
Right.
So let's say that, because the reason I bring up this question is because most people, when they deload, I think in their mind that means 7 days of light exercise or nothing. So what I was going to ask, if a client feels beat up or yourself, and you say, let's take a couple of days off, you would then just pick up whatever the next workout was supposed to be.
Yes. Me personally, I like to do the next workout in sequence. I don't like to skip, like if somebody was benching on Monday and somebody liked the bench on Monday and they were feeling beat up. So we took off Wednesday's workout and Thursday's workout. If they wanted to come back to training on Monday with the bench press, then I'm okay with that. Some people like to have a certain day on a certain day of the week. We would just adjust appropriately because in the long run, it's not really going to matter. We just have to make appropriate adjustments. But for everybody else, I would come to the next workout in sequence because I like to keep as much balance as I can, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I've slowly transitioned to, I used to be like, this is this day, this day, this day. And now I'm kind of just like every other day. But if I know that next day I like have an event or I have to go to my in-laws or whatever, then I just move that workout either to the day before or the day after. And I feel like as you get older, you realize that's not that much big of a deal that you thought it was when you were younger. Like, oh my God, my chest is gonna atrophy by 0.2% or whatever. As you get older, you realize, hey, it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah, I mean the bigger point is like we live in a lifting culture that considers the body to be very fragile. And as you gain experience as a lifter, you realize it's really not. And a lot of this just comes down to personal preference.
Yep, yep. I'd agree with that for sure. What would you consider? Because I feel like the terms beginner, intermediate, and advanced get thrown around a lot, but do you feel like there's an actual distinction, like amount of years training, or do you know what I'm trying to say? Like, do you think that you can actually pocket people into those three distinctions?
It's a very complex subject, and I've made videos on this before, but you will see somebody deadlifting 585 pounds on Instagram that has no freaking idea what form is, right? And like, no disrespect meant, but the question is, would you consider them a beginner or an intermediate, or what do you consider somebody that's super strong and got super strong doing everything incorrect? So, do I particularly care for these terms? No, I really, really don't. I do think calling somebody a novice that is new to lifting is appropriate because it's a good distinction. I've never touched a weight before. I have no idea what I'm doing. I haven't been through the neuromuscular adaptation. It's okay. And I think at the other end of the spectrum, an advanced lifter doesn't need to be told how to program. It doesn't mean they can't get a coach. It doesn't mean they can't go and train at Westside or California Barbell or get an advanced coach. But the majority of gym advanced lifters don't need to be told how to train. They know how to program, they know how to adjust things and fit it to their body. And their programs generally don't make a heck of a lot of sense to anybody from the outside because they have a whole history of injuries and preferences and things they like and don't like. But an advanced lifter generally has their nutrition together and their programming together, even if they're not thinking about it. So I think at the opposite ends of the spectrum, you have a true novice and a true advanced lifter. And in the middle, you have varying degrees of people trying to figure out programming, trying to figure out exercise form, and, figuring out programming. Part of the process is getting somebody off of the program hopping. A program hopper is a beginner mentality. They're looking, and that's not an insult, but it's a trait. I think there are traits of beginners, right? And not to make this into a long-winded ramble, but you can have guys that really don't have the best form, but they have applied progressive overload and nutrition over time to the point where they've gotten a lot of, mileage out of their training. So where do you classify them? I know as a beginner, their form might be beginner form, but their attitude and their nutrition, everything else is just excellent.
Yeah, that's something that's always confused me because, like you just said, do you classify someone by the amount of weight they're moving, the amount of muscle mass they have, the amount of time they've been training? It's such a weird bubble. It's hard to classify what is what at a certain point.
I would say, if I could just say one thing, when you become an experienced lifter and you walk into you know what it takes. You walk into a commercial gym, you know who is on the right track, who's an advanced lifter. Like, you can just tell by the way they train. You don't need to know their program specifics. You don't need to know their diet. They're over in the corner giving it hell, and because of the way they look and the way they train, that they're a serious focus lifter, however you want to call that.
That makes sense. On average, how long would you say for most people a workout should last?
I mean, if you are getting over 75 minutes, you can certainly train over 75 minutes. I'm not trying to make a rule, but, on any given day, if I have more energy, I might train a little bit longer. But for someone that's not deadlifting 600, 500, 600 pounds, where the warm-ups can take 30 to 45 minutes, I think 75 minutes is, for me, like if I have clients going over 75 minutes, I'll try to ask them, do we want to remove anything? That's kind of my red line.
Yeah, mine's always been about an hour to an hour 15. I feel like that's a reasonable time. Like you said, you can go over to maybe 90 minutes or whatever. But once you start getting into like the 2 hour rep range, unless you're doing something like you just said, where the amount of weight you're moving requires more rest and things like that, there's no reason to be going longer than that. When it comes to just cardiovascular or cardio, how do you mix that in without, let's say, compromising strength and muscle gains?
I think the key thing we need to understand as a foundation is the body is not that fragile. So there is a lot of fear that doing excessive or even moderate amounts of cardio is somehow going to compromise. The body will adapt. That doesn't mean you need to do a lot of it. The baseline for me, I'm not going to set goals for people, but for general health, you probably should be getting 7,000 steps in a day. You probably should be getting in an hour a week of some form of additional movement other than steps. Hiking, swimming, biking, Stairmaster. I think those are reasonable minimums for somebody that wants to be health focused and doesn't want to just be a body or be a strong body, if that makes sense. And if somebody wants to go beyond that, they're training for MMA or they're training for endurance running, we probably have to have a little bit more attention to detail to the overall structure.
That makes sense. Yeah, I feel like I remember when I first started, it was like no cardio, cardio and strength don't go together. And then there was just a day I realized like I've never been like super obese, but I've never even really been that chubby to be honest. But I remember thinking to myself, I'm like, why did I just get winded from running up the stairs? And there was one flight of stairs. I was like, I was like 24. I'm like, that shouldn't happen. Like, so then I started doing things like hill sprints and sled drags and whatever. It's always important, no matter, in my opinion, no matter what walk of life you're going into, whether athletic or otherwise, you have to have a good gas tank. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, people will often try to create a formula like, if I increase my conditioning to X level, what will be the benefit of lifting? Well, it's not a simple formula, but we do know the downsides when it comes to health, and there's only potential downsides when you're training. You just need a minimal amount of cardiovascular proficiency to not make you feel like a wet sack of crap in the gym. On the opposite end of the spectrum, for 4 or 5 years, I ran 12 to 14 hours a week, and it didn't impact my training at all. But I'm not advocating this, but I learned the body is very, very resilient and able to adapt to even extreme things like that.
Yeah, we're not as fragile as people think. As long as I feel like as long as you're not spiking everything up at once, like, oh, I'm gonna lift weights 6 times a week and then I'm gonna run 10 miles a day. Like if you go from nothing to that, then okay, obviously your body's not gonna be able to handle it. But if you build up to a certain level, you'll get there and you'll be able to maintain it. When it comes to older lifters, maybe just starting, maybe someone just started strength training in their, let's say, early 40s. What approach would you have for someone like that?
Well, first off, I'll say we tend to focus on the seasoned lifter as, from just simply the physical standpoint, but generally they come to the game a little bit more mentally strong. So we need to be aware of that as a coach. You give them a plan, they execute the plan. There's obviously guys, I will say the guys that are obese and are in bad habits with eating are another story because they tend not to have that discipline. They tend to be seafood, eat food, want food. And I'm not being disrespectful. That's just, but the guys that the mental discipline tends to be there. So whatever you give them, they tend to do and not question it, which is a good thing in coaching. The only thing I can tell you of coaching, and I've coached Special Olympics, I've coached blind athletes, I've coached athletes with such a limited amount of cognitive function. They'll be in the middle of a deadlift and they'll see a bird and get distracted. And it sounds silly, but I've trained all range of people. And really, it all comes down to giving them a reasonable starting point, listening to their injury history and taking that seriously. I can't do the overhead, it hurts my shoulder, my knees, whatever. Even if it's not valid, we don't care. We're going to take that seriously. Meeting them where they're at, not focusing on just barbell only. Not going into the cult of barbell. By the cult of barbell, it's like let's give grandma squats and deadlifts. Like I get people come to me all the time like, my grandma is 60 and I want to get her to lift, and I put her on strong lifts. I'm like, what are we doing? Let's maybe do a machine and a dumbbell. But very much, I think dumbbells and machines are a good 70% of things. Let's get them with the dumbbells. Let's get them with the machines, and let's see what they're capable of, and introduce barbell exercises where it makes sense. Obviously, men and women over 50 are able to do an overhead press and a bench press. But beyond that, when it comes to hinges and squats, we have to take that individual by individual.
Okay, and just from me being a fan of the conjugate method, I'm sure your exercise rotation is much less than someone like myself. But when would you ever, let's say you're doing barbell bench press as your first exercise, when would you swap that out for something else, if you do?
Well, I think some people view me as like a non-conjugate person, but I work in variation. Like at my peak of upper body strength, I was doing AB variations, constantly AB variations. And I was more pragmatic. I want to work in all these exercises and I don't know how to do it. So I do AB, not inherently conjugate, but obviously you're working in variations. So I generally work with clients in 3, 4, 5 month phases, and how long that phase goes. I mean, if somebody's running hot and getting a lot of progress out of a phase and doesn't want to quit, we're not going to quit. And because they're not trying to be, necessarily world-class strength athletes. But whenever we enter a new phase of training, I like to introduce new variables because you can, hey, maybe they like the Larson press. Maybe they like this variation of maybe they like the barrel press. Part of it is introducing them to things like when you have a kid and you take them to a new restaurant, they've had no experience with that, so they don't know if they like it or they don't like it. So I'm dealing with a lot of athletes like that, and I will kind of slowly slip in new things. The first phase, when I'm with a new individual, the first phase is like a dance. We're getting to know their capabilities, what they like, what they don't like, what they're good at. I hate this, I like this. And then from there, we start to slip in things that are kind of in their wheelhouse.
Okay, so there's clearly no like just switching exercise for the sake of switching. Like if something's going, then you're pedal to the floor until it stops.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, I'm not switching exercises for arbitrary reasons. Uh, you know, I mean, if I'm going to put in an exercise, it's just going to be more to expose the client to something that didn't fit into a program to see if they like it, if they're interested in it.
Yeah, because when I first started doing conjugate, to me it was like, oh, you can never do the same exercise twice in a row, and it's just you're all over the place. So then you find that it's like, hey, it's not the end of the world if you do max effort squats 2 weeks in a row. Like unless you're at an X amount of weight that you're moving.
When I was at my strongest, the year of my training was extremely intuitive. I didn't know what I was going to do, but during warm-ups, I figured it out. Okay, maybe today I'm going to do 3-inch block pulls. Maybe today I'm going to do sumo. Maybe today I'm going to do chains. But it always varied, but it was always very intuitive. Would this approach work for most people? No. But was it more like conjugate at its heart? Probably.
How do you, so back to the, like, let's say, I know we just talked about how it's hard to put people into these categories, but when it comes to volume, if you're getting someone, let's say they've only been lifting weights for 6 months, what type of, or I'll use your terms, how many hard sets would they get compared to, let's say, someone that's come to you and they've been lifting for 3 years? What's the difference between those two?
If I have somebody and I know they're physically capable, I mean, meaning they're, not like you can tell when somebody comes to you and they're a little bit on the frail side. They haven't touched weights. We have to ease into things. We're going to do a lot of straight sets. We're not going to waste their time changing weights or complicating things. If I have somebody I know is going to be reasonably proficient, has some experience lifting, just hasn't seen a lot of results, generally about 50% of their sets are going to be not to failure because I don't use that, but they're going to be encouraged to push for maximum safe quality reps, at least one per exercise. And from there, we kind of learn their capabilities.
Okay, okay, that makes sense. And just before we have our close off question, you're the first person I'm going to try doing this. I'm going to end these with just 20 rapid fire questions that have to do with lifting. You give me a one word answer.
Okay, I'll do
Okay.
my best. I'll do my best.
Okay. So, favorite lift?
Deadlift,
Would you prefer to bulk or cut?
bulk,
Okay. Back squats or front squats?
back squats,
Strength or size?
power building,
Chicken or beef?
beef,
Okay. Train in the morning or train in the evening?
evening,
Long distance cardio or high intensity?
long distance, in the woods, all day.
Barbells or dumbbells?
Dumbbells,
Heavy or volume training?
heavy,
Coffee or pre workout?
coffee.
Bench, overhead press, or incline?
It's bench and overhead press,
Home gym or public gym?
home gym,
Powerlifting or bodybuilding?
power building,
Free weights or machines?
free weights,
Favorite cheat meal?
nachos,
And one word to describe massive iron.
power building.
Okay. Okay. Good answers. So what, and you know what? I feel like that term has, I said let's sign off, but that term has gotten some hate lately, power building.
Yeah.
It's because people say like, oh, there's no sport of power building, but like, come on. I think a 10-year-old can figure out what the term power building, it means you train heavy, but there's some hypertrophy focus. Would I be spot on with that?
Yeah, I mean, power building went through a stage where everybody was making a video about it. I started using the term, and I'm not saying I was the first to use the term, but I started using the term around 2008 because I was introduced to powerlifting. I had come from a bodybuilding background. And the way I had always used it is I was a bodybuilder that loved strength. Okay. And that is a distinction between a bodybuilder that just loves hypertrophy, that doesn't love strength as well. And you can be a bodybuilder that doesn't love strength. So that's my personal distinction.
That makes sense. And what I get to all my guests to do is to, as they sign off, it's like 1 to 2 minutes, their message for everyone. Maybe it's like your mission statement of your business, just something you want to say to the world. Just 2 minutes, you have the stage.
All right. So we live in a world where a lot of the fitness content has to do with restriction. It's creating a narrow path. It's creating fear. It's putting you in a position where you don't know whether to turn left or whether you don't know whether to turn right. And I will tell you this is toxic. It's not that some things aren't better than others, but modern fitness content is creating fear. And in the gym, the thing you need to understand is there is a wide path and a lot of freedom. A good source of information is going to be one that gives you freedom. If you look at training over the last 70 years, powerlifting, bodybuilding, and you look at all the advanced lifters, you'll find out they all train differently. What this tells us is that there's a wider path than what these fitness influencers are teaching. We need to use reasonable methods, but we should not live in fear, and we should be very fearful of anybody that teaches you a narrow path or places you in a position of fear.
Very well said. All right, everyone. So that's today's episode. Steve, did you want to plug your YouTube and Instagram?
Sure. I'd love to follow you on Instagram at Ben the Barman. I'm not an influencer. I'm just a guy who likes to lift, and I will follow you back. And I'm on YouTube at Massive Iron.
So that's today's episode. Go follow those socials, like, share, subscribe. You know what to do. And as always, everyone, class is dismissed.